While Democrats are at least attempting to move ahead on impeachment, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is throwing cold water on that move. Let's go to NBC's Sahil Kapoor, who's joining me now. I have a feeling you're going to pick up where Josh left off, Sahil. What are lawmakers saying about all this?
Alex, there's anger, there's fury, there's dismay, and most notably among Democrats, there's determination to do something about President Trump. They don't want to be the opposition party that sits back and doesn't act on something as grave as this. Now, the top two Democrats in Congress, Nancy Pelosi in the House and Chuck Schumer in the Senate, have said that the president should resign, the cabinet should remove him. As Josh pointed out, that is looking highly unlikely, and the only option they have here, if that doesn't happen, is impeachment. They're already circulating among Democrats articles of impeachment. One single article called Incitement of Insurrection that accuses the president of willfully inciting violence against the government of the United States, a charge every bit as serious as it sounds. That is an article of impeachment that Democrats appear likely to take up as early as next week.
All right, people, welcome back to Dr. John Podcast. More than 120 lawmakers, including some Republicans, have now publicly called on Trump to resign, a stunning break from within his own party. The knife is coming from inside the House, and the scale of the defections is unprecedented. Now, you might be wondering how Trump responded to this avalanche of calls for his resignation. And let me tell you, the response was exactly what you would expect from a man who views any criticism, even from his own allies, as a personal betrayal. Full meltdown mode on Truth Social. He called it a coup. He attacked Republicans by name, publicly and viciously, isolating himself further from the very people he needs to hold on to power and get anything done in the final stretch of this term. And the wilder part, the thing that makes this story genuinely different from every previous moment of Republican discontent with Trump, is that his reaction is making things worse, not better. Every attack on a fellow Republican pushes more of them toward the exits.
If there's no intervening action between then, let's take a listen to what Speaker Pelosi said on 60 Minutes, capturing how she feels about this.
Sadly, the person who's running the executive branch is a deranged, unhinged, dangerous president of the United States. And only a number of days until we can be protected from him. But he has done something so serious that there should be prosecution against him.
Well, I gather that the 25th Amendment is off the table.
No, it isn't. Nothing is off the table.
Now, the Speaker has even inquired about the president's access to the nuclear codes to give you a sense of where her mind is at the moment. The biggest problem for Democrats at this point is the calendar. President Trump has only 11 days in office left, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, the top Republican, has not explicitly taken a position on the issue of impeachment and conviction, but he is quietly throwing cold water on the idea by circulating a memo pointing out that without unanimous consent, which is how the Senate does pretty much anything quickly, it is not going to be able to receive any articles of impeachment on January 19th.
Every meltdown post gives the critics more ammunition and more cover to speak openly and forcefully. Every accusation of betrayal drives another wedge into a party that is already cracking down the middle in ways that are showing up in very concrete and very consequential legislative outcomes that are reshaping the political landscape right before our eyes. This is not the Democrats doing this to Trump. This is happening from the inside, from within his own coalition, and that changes everything about how this story needs to be understood and what it actually means for the months ahead. Because when your own troops start turning against you, when the people who were supposed to have your back start publicly calling for your removal, when the legislative machinery you control starts grinding to a halt because members of your own party are actively blocking your agenda, you are no longer fighting a two-front war.
That is one day before President-elect Biden takes office. That puts Democrats in a position of deciding, do they want to spend some of the early days of Joe Biden's presidency focusing on impeaching and convicting the previous president? The last thing here to keep in mind, the main utility of throwing Donald Trump out of office via impeachment and conviction would be to prevent him from running for office again. Under the Constitution, he is entitled to seek a second term. There are rumors that he might do that in 2024. If Democrats pursue the article of impeachment and are able to convict him, a big if, they intend to include language to bar him from ever running for president again. Alex?
Yeah, you've given us a very realistic breakdown on what's to come, but I had that conversation with Melissa Murray, an NYU law professor, of exactly if that could be accomplished in the last hour. Thank you, Sahil, for that.
You are fighting a war where the enemy is inside the gates and the gates are not holding. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looks like in the halls of Congress right now, because the raw numbers tell only part of the story. Behind the scenes, Republicans are withholding votes at critical moments because they are pushing the Republican Party to meet them halfway on extending tax credits related to health care and Obamacare that were approved during the COVID crisis. That is the sticking point. That is the concrete legislative obstacle that has brought the Republican agenda to a halt in ways that are genuinely unprecedented for a party that controls both chambers of Congress. And we know that Trump met with the 4 leaders of Congress, and the Democrats came out saying that disagreements remain, that the meetings did not produce the breakthroughs the administration had hoped for. But here is the part of that story that gets buried in the mainstream coverage. It is not just Democratic opposition that is killing Trump's legislative priorities.
More than 200 House members and over 37 senators are now calling on U.S. President Donald Trump to resign, be removed from office, or face impeachment. Top Republicans joining that list.
Well, I think the best way for our country, Chuck, is for the president to resign and go away as soon as possible.
Even the president's former acting chief of staff and one of his greatest offenders has had enough.
The ideas of the Republican Party are bigger than one man. But I think if you have any role at all in what happened on Wednesday, that you don't deserve to leave the party anymore.
A procession carrying the body of Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, killed in the riots, drove by the Capitol Sunday afternoon, when the White House finally lowered its flag to half-mast. The flag was lowered at the Capitol Friday. The president remains out of sight, as many lawmakers fear what his loyalists may do next.
The number of death threats that have been thrown out against people like me and, frankly, every member of Congress. Look at Vice President Pence, one of the most faithful guys to Donald Trump, is now public enemy #1 in Trump world.
Several sources inside the White House say President Trump hasn't spoken to Pence since the siege.
It is Republican opposition from within. Republican members are the ones forcing delays. Republican members are the ones pulling floor votes. Republican members are the ones leaving the legislative calendar in chaos because they refuse to fall in line on key pieces of the Trump agenda. Speaker Mike Johnson has had to abandon floor agendas multiple times, not because Democrats found the votes to stop him, but because he could not keep his own conference in line. And when you see that pattern clearly, when you understand that the legislative sabotage is coming from inside the House, the resignation demands stop looking like an isolated political statement and start looking like the visible tip of a much larger iceberg that is threatening to sink the entire ship.
Meanwhile, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is requesting members return to Washington. An article of impeachment against the president is expected to be introduced late Monday or Tuesday, but some want to delay a possible Senate trial.
Let's give President-elect Biden the 100 days he needs to get his agenda off and running, and maybe we'll send the articles sometimes after that.
To protect lawmakers and others, Twitter has silenced the president. Apple and Amazon have cracked down on another site favored by extremists, Parler. Washington is under a state of emergency. Its mayor has asked the Department of Homeland Security for added protection starting Monday, as the National Guard erects what it says is a non-scalable fence protecting the Capitol ahead of Inauguration Day. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
Now, I want to be very clear about something right up front because context matters here, and I am not going to play games with it. This is not the first time Trump has faced resignation calls from within his own party. It happened before, right after January 6th, when the Capitol was stormed and a significant chunk of the Republican establishment momentarily broke from him and seriously discussed resignation, impeachment, and the 25th Amendment as real options. That moment passed. Trump survived it. The party largely came back around. And Trump supporters spent the next few years pointing to that survival as proof that he was untouchable, that no matter what happened, the party would never actually follow through on removing him. But here is what is different about this moment. The scale is bigger. The context is messier. And the specific nature of the sabotage going on inside the Republican Party right now goes far beyond just a few angry statements to the press. We are talking about Republicans actively blocking Trump's own legislative agenda in Congress, killing his bills, forcing Speaker Mike Johnson to pull floor votes, leaving Capitol Hill barely functional because of internal GOP dissent. Not Democratic opposition, not progressive obstruction, but Republican members refusing to fall in line. That is a different level of fracture than anything we saw saw in 2021. That earlier moment was a rupture at the end of a term, when Trump was heading out of office anyway, and Republicans who were uneasy could tell themselves that the problem was going to resolve itself in a matter of days, regardless of what they did. This is different. This is happening while Trump is actively sitting in the Oval Office trying to govern. This is not a post-presidency rebellion. This is a live internal war inside the party that is supposed to be united behind him, and it is happening in real time while the legislative calendar ticks forward and the administration's priorities pile up in a growing graveyard of failed bills and abandoned agendas. So let's talk about what is actually going on, because the full picture here is more complicated and more consequential than most of the coverage is capturing. On one level, you have the resignation calls, the formal public demands from lawmakers saying Trump should leave office. On another level, you have the legislative sabotage, Republicans in the House and Senate blocking Trump's own agenda from the inside. And underneath both of those, you have the quieter, more dangerous conversation happening in private about impeachment, about the 25th Amendment, about what constitutional tools exist if things continue to spiral. And all three of those tracks are running simultaneously right now, not as isolated events, but as connected symptoms of the same underlying problem. A significant portion of the Republican Party has concluded that Trump is currently operating is a threat to their own political survival. And political survival for politicians always wins. Always. The question is not whether self-preservation instincts are real. The question is whether enough Republicans have reached a point where breaking from Trump is less dangerous to their future than staying attached to him. And based on what we are seeing right now, based on the documented evidence of legislative sabotage and public resignation demands and private constitutional conversations, we may be closer to that tipping point than at any previous moment in this presidency. And here is why that matters for everyone watching, not just political junkies, not just people who follow Congress closely, for everyone. Because the story of Trump's power has always been built on a specific myth, the myth of total loyalty. The idea that the Republican Party was unified behind him in a way that made opposition from within essentially impossible. That myth, that very specific political story, is what made Trump untouchable for so long. It is what made primary challengers back down. It is what made Senate Republicans vote against impeachment even when their private statements made clear they believed he had crossed serious lines. The myth of total loyalty is the load-bearing wall of Trump's political power. And right now, that wall has cracks in it that were not there before. More than 120 lawmakers calling for his resignation. His own bills dying in a Republican-controlled Congress. His Truth Social feed becoming a documented record of rage directed at members of his own party. If that wall comes down, or even if it bends significantly, the entire structure of his remaining political power changes with it. That is the story, and we are going to break it down completely. But before we get into the mechanics of how this is all playing out, the legislation, the constitutional conversations, the specific Republicans who are driving this, I want to take a step back and ask the question that I think actually matters most here. How do we get to a place where more than 120 lawmakers feel comfortable publicly demanding that a sitting president from their own party resign? Because that does not happen by accident. That does not happen overnight. That does not happen because one bad news cycle spooked a few people and they overreacted. That is the product of a specific sustained series of events, mounting scandals that refused to die, repeated legislative failures that made the administration look weak and ineffective, foreign policy decisions that alarmed allies and members of Congress alike, legal chaos that refuses to resolve itself quietly. All of it accumulated over time to the point where the political calculation for a meaningful number of Republicans genuinely flipped, where staying silent became more dangerous than speaking up, where the cost of continued unconditional association with Trump's most chaotic behavior started to outweigh the benefit of his base's loyalty in their specific districts and states. And understanding how that calculation flipped for whom and why and when is the key to understanding everything that comes next. Let's build the full picture because this story has layers that the headline number of 120 lawmakers does not begin to capture on its own. Let's slow down and really walk through the mechanics of what is happening inside the Republican Party right now. Because the mainstream coverage of this story tends to focus on the most dramatic moments, the resignation demands, the Truth Social meltdowns, the screaming of coup, and misses the quieter structural thing that is actually driving all of it. And that structural thing is this. Republicans in Congress have been quietly sabotaging Trump's legislative agenda for months. Not Democrats, Republicans. And that is the detail that changes the entire meaning of this political moment if you take the time to understand it properly. Let's start with the specifics, because specifics matter. The Save America Act, one of Trump's priority pieces of legislation, has been repeatedly blocked in Congress, not by Democratic opposition, but by Republican dissent. The $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund that Trump pushed for, same story. Republicans in the Senate and the House have been the ones forcing delays, pulling floor votes, and leaving the legislative calendar in chaos. Speaker Mike Johnson has had to abandon floor agendas multiple times, not because Democrats found the votes to stop him, but because he could not keep his own conference in line. And reporting on this makes something very clear. This is not a few isolated rebels. This is a pattern, a sustained, organized pattern of Republican members deciding that certain parts of Trump's agenda are too toxic, too risky, or too politically costly for them to support. And when you see that pattern clearly, when you understand that the legislative sabotage is coming from inside the House, the resignation demands stop looking like an isolated political statement and start looking like the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. Now let's talk about the constitutional dimension of this, because it is genuinely important and also genuinely underreported. The conversations happening in private among Republicans and among legal and political analysts are not just about resignation. They are broader than that. A congressional document titled Support for the Removal of Donald J. Trump from Office, compiled from statements by prominent Republicans and conservatives, lays out the full range of options being discussed. Resignation, impeachment and conviction, invocation of the 25th Amendment, all three are on the table in this document. And the document includes statements from people like Chris Christie, not a fringe figure, not a Democrat, but a former Republican governor and presidential candidate who argues that Trump must leave office immediately through one of those three mechanisms. Now, a document like that circulating among lawmakers and political figures is significant. It is not just an opposition research file. It is evidence that the conversation about constitutional removal has moved out of the fringe and into a space where serious Republican voices are engaging with it as a real option. Are we there yet? Are we at the point where impeachment or the 25th Amendment is imminent? No, almost certainly not right now. But the fact that the conversation is happening at this level in these terms with these participants is itself a major development that the raw resignation demand headline does not fully convey. And then there is the behavioral dimension, the specific things Trump has done during this period that have accelerated the internal revolt. Reports of Oval Office blow-ups that have alarmed people who were in the room. Statements about Iran that included references to standing orders to attack the country if Trump were assassinated. A kind of escalatory posture that rattled foreign policy professionals across the ideological spectrum and raised real questions about the decision-making process at the top of the administration. Social media behavior that has at various points prompted even Trump-aligned commentators to express private concern about the president's stability and judgment. None of this is coming from Trump's enemies. Some of it is coming from people who supported him, who voted for him, who want his agenda to succeed, but who are genuinely alarmed by specific behaviors and specific statements that they believe are making that success less likely. And those private alarms are the engine behind the more public actions, the resignation calls, the legislative revolts, the quiet conversations about constitutional options. The public statements are almost always the last thing to happen. The private alarm comes first, and the private alarm has been building for a while. The first time a significant chunk of Republicans broke from Trump was after January 6th. That was the moment when Speaker Pelosi moved toward a second impeachment, and some Republicans, including figures who had previously been steadfast loyalists, started seriously discussing whether Trump needed to be removed before Biden's inauguration. That moment produced real resignation calls, real impeachment votes, real 25th Amendment discussions, and then it passed. Trump survived. The party largely reconsolidated around him, and the lesson that Trump and his team took from that survival was essentially, we can weather anything. The party will always come back. Loyalty always wins in the end. But this current moment is structurally different from that earlier moment in several important ways. In that earlier moment, Trump was heading out of office anyway. There was a known end date. Republicans who were uneasy could tell themselves that the problem was going to resolve itself in a matter of days, regardless of what they did. That calculus does not exist now. Trump is not at the end of his term. He is in the middle of it. If Republicans who are alarmed by his behavior want things to change, they cannot just run out the clock. They have to act, or they have to make a conscious choice not to act and live with the consequences of that choice. That is a fundamentally different decision than what Republicans faced in that earlier moment. And it is one reason why the current moment feels to people who study these dynamics closely more potentially consequential than any previous rupture between Trump and his party. And then there is the electoral pressure point, the one that ultimately drives everything in politics. When you strip away all the ideology and all the principle and get down to the raw math of political survival, swing district Republicans, the members who won in competitive districts where a Democratic wave in the upcoming midterms could flip their seats, those members are running their own math right now. They are looking at Trump's approval numbers in their specific districts. They are looking at how voters in those districts feel about the foreign policy decisions, the Oval Office blow-ups, the Truth Social meltdowns. And some of them are concluding that continued unconditional association with all of it, not with Trump generally, but with the specific behaviors and decisions that are generating the most concern, is a liability they cannot afford to carry into a midterm election. That is not a moral calculation. That is a survival calculation. And when survival instincts kick in for a critical mass of Republican lawmakers at the same time, that is when the internal dynamics of a political party start to shift in ways that become very hard for any leader to control, even a leader with Trump's history of political resilience. The sabotage from within is real. It is organized and it is already working. This is not a handful of malcontents venting to reporters while ultimately voting the party line. The Republican dissent that is playing out in Congress right now is having real legislative consequences. Trump's bills are dying. His floor agendas are being pulled. His spending priorities are being blocked by members of his own caucus. And the specific pattern matters. It is not random. It is concentrated around the parts of Trump's agenda that swing district Republicans and institutionally minded conservatives find most politically toxic or constitutionally concerning. They are not blocking everything. They are being selective. They are building a record of independence from the most controversial elements of the Trump program while staying broadly within the party coalition. That is a sophisticated political play. That is not rebellion for the sake of rebellion. That is members of Congress calculating that they can survive Trump's anger in the short term because the political cost of full alignment is higher than the cost of selective resistance. And every time a Trump bill dies in a Republican-controlled Congress, every single time it chips away at the central narrative of his presidency, which is that he is a powerful, effective, dominant leader who gets things done. You cannot sustain that narrative when your own party is the reason things are not getting done. And Trump knows it, which is why the Truth Social meltdowns keep happening, and which is why those meltdowns keep making things worse. The resignation demands are significant even if they do not immediately succeed. 120 lawmakers publicly calling for a sitting president to resign is not a minor event regardless of whether it leads directly to resignation, impeachment, or any formal action. It is a data point, a highly visible, publicly documented data point about where sentiment inside and around the Republican Party has moved. And the fact that the number includes Republicans, even a relatively small number of Republicans compared to the full congressional caucus, is the thing that gives it weight because it breaks the myth. Every Republican who puts their name on a resignation demand makes it marginally easier for the next Republican to do the same. Every public statement of no confidence creates cover for others to express private doubts more openly. The dynamic compounds over time. And while 120 is not enough on its own to force any formal action, it is enough to change the political atmosphere inside the Republican Party in ways that have downstream consequences for everything from legislative negotiation to midterm positioning to the early maneuvering around the next presidential election. Do not underestimate a number just because it falls short of a threshold. Numbers that fall short of thresholds can still move everything around them. The constitutional options being discussed are more serious than they appear. The document circulating among lawmakers compiling statements from figures like Chris Christie calling for Trump's removal through resignation, impeachment, or the 25th Amendment is not just a political curiosity. It is evidence that the conversation about constitutional removal has moved from the fringes into a space where credible, serious, Republican-aligned voices are engaging with it openly. Now, does that mean impeachment is coming? Almost certainly not in the near term. The votes are not there. The political will for a formal impeachment process in a Republican-controlled Congress is not present right now. But the 25th Amendment conversation is worth understanding separately from impeachment because it has a different dynamic. The 25th Amendment does not require Congress to initiate it. It requires the Vice President and a majority of the cabinet. And the Vice President right now is an elected official who cannot be fired, who has his own donor network and his own future ambitions, who has already demonstrated a capacity to completely reverse his stated positions about Trump when his own interests demand it. The 25th Amendment is not something that happens on a political whim, but the structural pieces that would need to be in place for it to be a real option: a Vice President with independent standing, cabinet members with genuine concerns, a public conversation that has normalized the idea of constitutional removal. Those pieces are closer to being in place right now than they have been at any previous point in this presidency. And that is worth paying attention to, even if the scenario remains unlikely in the immediate term. Trump's myth of total loyalty is cracking. Over 120 lawmakers, including Republicans, are calling for his resignation. GOP senators are blocking his bills, and constitutional removal conversations are happening publicly. His frantic attacks on his own party reveal fear, not confidence, and the survival instincts of politicians are driving a fracture that may accelerate faster than anyone inside the coalition predicted.